Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. As the year draws to a close, we thought it might be good to take a look back at some of the key moments from the podcast in 2024. As ever, the show has featured authors and activists in conversation on a wide range of subjects, from neurodivergence and wealth inequality to the various harms inflicted by the state, from its slow, often hidden bureaucratic violence to the death and misery brought to bear through policing and militarism. We've talked about the resurgence of the far right and fascism, the horror of the genocide in Gaza, and the need for our movements to remember the lessons of past struggles and to embody different ways of caring for and relating to one another. It's been a real privilege to speak to so many impressive individuals and engage with so many fantastic books on the show over the past year. Unsurprisingly, a lot of these episodes have had a shared thematic resonance, and so I want to present a few of these conversations together here to better draw out some of these connections. So, in this episode's Curated Highlights, I speak to John Pring about the British government's Department for Work and Pensions and its horrific work capability assessment, to Robert Chapman about why the neurodiversity movement emerged when it did, its successes, and the limitations of a liberal orientation under neoliberal capitalism. I speak to Rafeef Ziadah, Riya and Katy Fox-Hoddess about international labour solidarity with Palestine and the need to try and organise with workers inside the factories that are producing weapons bound for Israel. I also speak to Liliana, Kalonji Changa and Joy James about COP cities and why the militarisation of policing necessitates a cognitive and strategic shift within our movements. All the books featured on the show in 2024 will be 40% off through plutobooks.com until the end of the year. Just use the coupon podcast at the checkout, and you can browse the full list of eligible books at plutobooks.com/podcast reading. So up first, here is John Pring, author of The Department, How a Violent Government Bureaucracy Killed Hundreds and Hid the Evidence. This is from our episode released on the 20th of August. I think what you were saying there about like the continuity between the successive governments, Tory and then New Labour and then back to the coalition government is really apposite. And like you talked about that 20% figure earlier as being the recurring, magic number. I think you refer in the book to actually like Peter Hain describing the aim for half of new claimants during the work capability assessment process to be found fit for work. I mean, this just seems, firstly, an astronomically high figure, but it also seems to speak to the fact that, the government's starting off from a sort of a budgetary concern position and then working backwards from there, rather than starting from an honest sort of assessment of what people's actual needs are.
Exactly right. There was no hint of any research that I found, definitely through the 90s. And obviously this is like the 20-year rule with the National Archives. So I was really only able to get papers up to 2002, whatever. So, but anyway, in that period I looked at, there was no hint of any research in that department on, right, how many people do we really think need support and how many people should be getting it? It was all about, well, this is clearly too high. How much can we get away with cutting? And then how can we justify it? And we justify it by feeding lines to the media. James Pennell said some particularly vile things to the Liverpool Echo at one point, I think. So yeah, it's not evidence-based. Other people have talked about this. It's policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. And that's what seems to come out of the DWP and still does.
Yeah.
And we're all on tenterhooks now as to what's going to happen because Labour's clearly going to act on personal independence payment, sanctions, work capability assessment, out-of-work benefits, universal credit. And so myself, but particularly a lot of disabled activists are very, very intent. We'll maybe talk about this later on, making sure that MPs are aware of the history of what will happen if they try this again.
Yeah. We've been talking about the high policy level, and obviously over time, you have new bits of legislation, you have new assessment procedures, even the department name changes. There's a lot of different acronyms and so on. So it's kind of hard to keep abreast of that within the scope of our conversation. But there's a lot of continuity. That's something we've already suggested. So, let's talk about, the all work test and then, what became, I guess, the work capability assessment, which is pretty infamous. I think anyone that remembers the austerity years knows what the work capability assessment was. It's described in the book by Professor Jeff Shepherd as being reckless, and then he sort of corrects himself and says, no, actually it was ruthless. He was a clinical psychologist involved initially in one of the DWP's working groups.
Yeah, so he was one of their advisors.
Yeah.
He was one of their advisors, and he and others were saying, don't do this. It's going to cause mayhem.
Let's talk about some of the actual, what was involved in these procedures, the work capability assessment and its predecessors, I guess. What was it designed to do? What did the people who were sort of forced to undergo that process, give us a bit more detail about just kind of why it was so horrific.
There are so many levels to it, but a lot of it was about the pressure that was put on people. So the work capability assessment, not everybody had to go to this face-to-face assessment, but it was often the face-to-face assessment that caused a lot of harm. And there were aspects to that harm. One of the aspects was that a lot of the assessors, so the assessors were all, at that point, in the early years of the harm, they're carried out by Atos, which was one of the big outsourcing companies, became absolutely notorious because of its association with the work capability assessment, and then later with the personal independence payment assessment, which is slightly different. So their assessors were often poorly trained, and there was a lot of suspicion that they had targets, that they were put under a lot of pressure to find people fit for work, and I don't think that's under any dispute at all. There was lots of pressure to find people fit for work, even though they weren't. And they carried out as many assessments as they could, and the more assessments they carried out, the more money they got. And another reason why it was really violent was because, particularly with people with mental distress, there wasn't enough emphasis on getting evidence from the people that knew them best, i.e. the doctors, the consultants, the psychiatrists, the community psychiatric nurses that actually had years of experience of what levels of distress these people were living with. And some of the people in the book, went to these assessments, and their benefits were decided on the basis of a 20, 30, 40-minute interview with someone who was really looking at them as a scrounger anyway, and just found them fit for work. Stephen Carre's case is one of the early ones, and it actually led to a coroner writing a letter to the DWP saying, stop doing it like this, because other people will die. And they made a tiny tweak in their procedures, but people did continue to die. Yeah, so that process of going through that assessment, often by people being put under a massive amount of pressure to find them fit for work. The assessment they first brought in 1995, and you have to give some credit to Mansell Aylward, who I write about a lot in the book, who introduced that test, the all-work test. Only doctors could carry that. Medically trained professionals were the only ones that could really work out whether somebody was fit for work or not. But by the time the work capability assessment came in 2008, and then really cranked up in 2010 onwards, it was like nurses and physiotherapists as well as doctors, which was just incredibly dangerous. So not enough training, not enough knowledge, this massive pressure. All behind this is the public pressure. Look at all these scroungers, look at all these benefit frauds, all these cheats. Why are they leeching off the state? And that kind of psychological pressure on people as well. And then if they did one thing wrong, if they miss an assessment, don't turn up. For instance, if they're just too ill to open their mail, not responding to their mail, they are very quickly just have the benefits just removed. And that's something that happened, for instance, in the later years to Errol Graham, who was really very seriously ill with his mental health and was just pretty much just locked in his flat. He just wasn't able to go to a face-to-face assessment. He just wasn't. And they just ended up, his gas was cut off. He had no money left, and he literally starved to death in his flat because the DWP cut off his benefits because he hadn't turned up to an assessment. That's the kind of thing they were doing. And it wasn't just him. And the tragedy of this, that's a tragedy on its own, but multiply that tragedy by however many times is there are so many people like that we will never know about because they didn't have people fighting for them at inquests or families that went to the media, which is only a very small proportion of people. Very rarely go to the media with intensely personal things like this. There's a very particular kind of person that goes, someone who's really, got this powerful impetus for social justice and putting wrong what's right. Other people are just too upset or just don't trust the media. So many cases And people that don't have family or friends, they just live very isolated lives, will never find out what happened to them. And they will have died similarly awful. The horror of his death is just, so I just can't get my head around it sometimes. And others as well. Faiza Ahmed's death is just different, not connected to the work capability assessment, but still the horror of what's going through their minds at the time. And the fact that that is provoked by the state, I still can't get my head around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what's so distressing in the book, is you convey these stories of these people who face this awful cruelty and violence. And I think the point you're making about the fact that, some of these family members obviously go on to really sort of fight for justice, but that must just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of representation of the number of people that suffered. The fact that the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities investigates the UK government over allegations of systematic and grave violations of disabled people's human rights is really damning. The UK being the first country to face such a high-level inquiry, and that many of the bereaved family members of the deceased are involved in providing evidence to this committee.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about that process? What was the assessment or recommendations of the findings, I suppose, of this UN committee? And what was the response, from the government to it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm laughing because the response was just so awful. But what's interesting and important about that inquiry by the UN committee, the reason it took place was because of action from disabled activists. And, my book would not have happened without that. Everything in this book stems from the work that disabled activists did, the disabled people's anti-cuts movement particularly. They basically bombarded the UN committee and said, look, this is what's happening. Here's the evidence. And they provided brilliant evidence. People like the late Debbie Jolly and another unbelievably fantastic disabled activists, and Linda Burnip and people at DPAC. And they persuaded the UN committee to carry out this investigation. Most of it was about the DWP's work. And eventually in late 2016, they found the UK government guilty of grave and systematic violations of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the government's response was just to completely dismiss it in a pretty shameful way. And they've never, ever really properly engaged. I mean, they go through the motions. And they have to. I mean, they couldn't leave the convention. I mean, that would just create too much of a fuss. So they just dismiss it and dispute it. They didn't engage with it. And then earlier this year, there's the follow-up to that report in Geneva again, and there is almost no progress. And in some areas, it's actually got worse. And that shows how little respect there has been for the rights of disabled people, particularly on these particular issues, and how they've just not been anywhere near the centre of the government's thinking over the last 10 years, particularly around social security and disabled people.
Yeah. I think you note in the book how, any suicide linked to the provision of, a mental health service, through the NHS or not even through the NHS, would be the subject of a lengthy and probing review, and that the contrast that you see with these deaths caused by the DWP is stark. You've already kind of suggested that not much ever changed as a result of the, prevention of future death reports, their own sort of internal reviews. It seems like nothing changed throughout the course of this history. Is that correct?
This is one of the frustrating things, is that some things have changed.
Yeah.
I mean, we know they have changed because, for instance, they have announced things, new processes they do, new teams they set up. They set up this serious case panel which looks at the overall kind of issues around serious cases, deaths. And I don't think any of this would have happened if we hadn't kicked up this massive fuss for years and years and years. I really don't think it would have done. But they never say, thanks for bringing this attention. We've done this because disabled people have kicked up a row. They just quietly do it. And then when there's another death, they say, oh yeah, but look, we've done this. They have done some small things. They haven't changed the culture of the department. The violence is still there. We know it's still there because people keep dying. I ran a story just yesterday. The Prime Minister's Implementation Unit did a report on universal credit and its support for what they call vulnerable claimants, which is, a lot of disabled people come into that group. A lot of people with mental distress, people with learning difficulties, autistic people come into that group. And this report said, well, you really need to check on what the minimum level of support is for these vulnerable claimants across job centres. And you need to test that your staff are aware of these policies and how these policies change, do these assurance exercises. But then the pandemic came and they got so wrapped up with how fantastic universal credit was during the pandemic and how it saved the world. And they said, look, all this nonsense was only driven by stakeholders, which is a kind of dismissive way they talk about activists. It's just stakeholders. They're just scaremongering. Yeah, we don't need to do this work. And then in the year or 2 years after that, at least 3 people I know of took their own lives because of the pressure of universal credit, because universal credit is not safe, and because they're continuing to harass people. And some of the cases, and one of them hasn't got to inquest yet. I've written about it a little bit in the book. Just horrific, the assessment. She was someone who's serious mental distress, barely left the house, and had to come into the job centre. She was allowed 1 phone call. So the first one, they let her do it by phone. She had a support worker with her. And she was told by this work coach that letting you do this one on the phone, but next time you're going to have to come into the job centre. And then a few days later, she took her own life. She couldn't cope with it. That's the kind of thing that's still happening. So yes, they have changed things around the edges, but there's no transparency. They're still hiding these secret reports. The culture of the department is still violent. There's no doubt about that. It just needs reform from top to bottom. Probably needs a completely new department. I don't think they'll do that. It needs an inquiry. It needs to be found not fit for purpose. It needs to be a police investigation into some of the conduct of senior civil servants and ministers over the years. They won't do that either, but keep asking for it just in case.
That was John Pring, author of The Department, How a Violent Government Bureaucracy Killed Hundreds and Hid the Evidence. Next up, we have Robert Chapman, author of Empire of Normality, Neurodiversity and Capitalism. This is from our episode released on the 8th of January. I mean, you've mentioned the orientation of the neurodivergent movement has been towards kind of reform, a sort of a liberal framework, which has seen, I guess, some results since, 2012, the last sort of 10 years or so. It has moved things forward, and there have been some achievements in society. Could you speak a little bit to, how the movement has changed things? And I guess then why there's kind of an inbuilt limitation to what it could achieve within that sort of framework.
So this is really important. And I want to be clear straight off that I'm not just completely dismissive of this approach or anything. I think it's been really successful, in fact. I guess the point I want to raise is, or the kind of provocation I want to raise for other people in the movement is that even though this has been successful in many ways, that it might have reached the limit of the kind of success it can have. And in fact, we need to go further. But yeah, the success has actually been significant in many ways. And it's worth talking about the basic tactic people use and the basic strategy. So we already have, at least it's different in different states, but we have disability rights legislation in many states, here in the UK, certainly. And there are also kind of international laws and so forth. These are relatively recent still, kind of 1990s, early 2000s. And they really arose out of the disabled persons movement, which was mostly people with physical disabilities. They were made with that in mind primarily. And things like ADHD and so all the kind of psychiatric diagnoses basically were not really thought of in a disability framework. They were thought of as mental disorders, slightly different. So people weren't drawing on this legislation to demand accommodations and things like that. So what the neurodiversity proponents have done, and I think quite successfully, is reinterpret things which were considered individual medical pathologies into disabilities, and then draw on that existing legislation to begin demanding changes, as well as make demands for perhaps for new legislation and so on. So instead of, say, just being ashamed that you're an autistic person or you're someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or something like that and hiding it, you might actually be able to go to work and kind of say, actually, I've got rights. I've got a right to, say, in the UK, we have a right to reasonable accommodations. If something's hard for you as a disabled person and stopping you working and stopping your access, you can have an accommodation for that, or at least legally you should. And this has been one powerful tool. People are doing this more, and as people are doing that, there has been a slight, there's more kind of neurodiversity pride and autistic pride and stuff like this, pushing back against shame and stigma and denial. And this has all been important. And we see much, more general changes as well, right? So, or just out in the world, you see all sorts of things. So, if you go to airports now, they often have a sensory room for autistic people who will struggle in the kind of intense sensory environment of the airport. in supermarkets, you have kind of autism hours where they dim the lights and turn the music down and stuff like that. So again, for people who struggle with the sensory environment, we'll be able to go at that time. These are important changes. And yet there are pretty significant limits as well. The way I think about this is, from a Marxian perspective, neurodivergent oppression doesn't just stem from negative views of us and just a lack of rights, but from the deeper structures of society, from the rise of capitalism, from how capitalism kind of orders us into hierarchies and ranks us in relation to our productivity, and sees some of us as subnormal and some of us as normal and some of us as supernormal. There's various intersections there as well. There's very much intertwined with the history of colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy and patriarchy and so on. And I do think there's some room for kind of wiggling around and getting, reducing stigma a bit within this system. And as I say, we've done that a little bit, but I think ultimately you can only go so far. And the kind of thing I was thinking about is, for instance, when we look at the statistics, from what we know at least, of how many neurodivergent people are incarcerated in prisons, for instance. So there was a study from last year which found in the UK about 25% of people incarcerated in our prisons have ADHD. One study from 2012, I think in Chelmsford Prison, found that about 50% of the inmates there had dyslexia or related learning disability. Similar kind of very high levels for other forms of neurodivergence. And that's before we even get to things like deaths in police custody and police violence and things like that for neurodivergent people, which are, again, as far as we know, much higher than the general population. We have a kind of very clear, I think, to my mind at least, a school to prison pipeline for neurodivergent people. All those people, of course, theoretically have rights, but they're still stuck in carceral systems. And many neurodivergent people, especially multiply marginalized, especially if you're Black, working class, and neurodivergent, you are much more likely to end up in a carceral system still than not. So often the people who benefit from the rights reformist-based approach tend to be the more privileged kind of people anyway. This kind of indicated to me, and this is the kind of case I make in the book, that we need to attend to the deeper structures of society rather than just rights and reforms. At the same time, something I've been increasingly concerned about, not just me, but many neurodiversity activists, is the co-option of neurodiversity. As it's become more mainstream, you've had this huge co-option of, sometimes people call it neurodiversity light, people in existing positions of power sort of rebrand as neurodiversity proponents. They slightly change their language and vocabularies and things like that. But really, they're kind of just upholding the dominant system and how it operates. Probably many of them very well-meaning, of course, right? But that's, still they're doing what they're doing. And this can be like psychologists or teachers, people in these kind of like social reproduction and health kind of services, or it can be politicians and so forth. So Matt Hancock, who was Conservative Health Secretary, and in my view, responsible for great suffering on behalf of neurodivergent and disabled people. Part of his rebranding has been to, he's left politics, but he's now the head of a neurodiversity charity. He is dyslexic himself, so he's neurodivergent, but I don't think he has his actions don't suggest that he has the interests of neurodivergent people. That's not what he's fighting for, quite the opposite, in fact. So we have this kind of mass co-option. I think liberal neurodiversity is much more open to that. And you also have businesses kind of trying to employ neurodivergent people increasingly, but only so far as it can kind of mine us for profit in various ways. Again, that will leave lots of neurodivergent people behind, people with more complex disabilities, people who are multiply marginalized and so forth. So these are the various kind of worries I have with the dominant approach. Part of them are inherent to that approach, and part of them are kind of at this current political moment. I think we've got this huge energy from the neurodiversity movement. Clearly, that there are many of us, there are many tens of thousands of us, perhaps millions of us, and it's growing all the time. But I think to direct this energy towards something liberatory, we have to develop a more radical politics to avoid this kind of neoliberal co-option of neurodiversity, basically.
I think you note in the book that in the sort of post-Fordist era, in the neoliberal era, autism diagnoses have increased quite dramatically. There's been a radical expansion of autism diagnoses. So what is it about this phase of capitalism that we're in now? Why has that led to an increase in mental disorders of one form or another?
Yeah, so As I said earlier, capitalism just does intensify in all these ways and it continues to restrict. But I describe post-Fordism in particular as a mass disabling event in the book. And I really wanted, again, this to make sense of why the neurodiversity movement arose when it did, why all these diagnoses have increased and stuff like that, and why people often find these diagnoses helpful for making sense of their lives, right? Why are people now saying, I am disabled, right? And I think there are a bunch of things here. Part of it is the rise of neoliberalism. There was a kind of mass crushing of the organized working class in the 1970s and 1980s. And you lose kind of all sorts of like protections and kind of the power of unions and stuff like this in all kinds of ways. And we end up working longer hours with less protections and stuff like that. So part of it's neoliberalism and just workers losing control and, having worse quality of life, basically. And of course, that's going to have really significant impacts on mental health and so forth. But one of the other big shifts I really detail is this kind of shift away from manufacturing towards emotional labor and towards a kind of cognitive capitalism, the production of kind of cognitive commodities or cognition as a kind of part of a knowledge economy. And it's worth saying all labor, even what we call manual labor, has, of course, a cognitive component and emotional components. But this shift really, in an important sense, tightens the norms of what kind of emotional and cognitive abilities you need to even have a relatively basic entry-level job. So it might be helpful thinking about this just with a concrete example. So one I sometimes use is the example of like a coffee shop barista, right? Often this is kind of seen as like a relatively unskilled job. You can train relatively quickly and so forth. Now, I don't think that, but I'm saying, often it seems like that. The pay isn't great and so forth. Lots of students and young people have these jobs, right? But actually, you need a really specific kind of set of cognitive and emotional capacities to be able to do that, right? So for a start, you've got to be in a pretty busy place often, which might have bright lights and coffee machines and loads of conversations going on. And even to be able to hear what your colleagues are saying or to take a customer order, you've already got to have a very particular sensory profile. And that's going to lock out loads of people who struggle, like myself, who are autistic and struggle with sensory processing, to hear voices and differentiate between background and foreground noise and so on. Not just that, you'll need capacities like really strong working memory, because someone's going to be ordering 5 different kinds of latte with different kinds of milk and stuff like this. And even if you've just got to hold that for a few seconds, that's really hard. I can't do that. You've got to have that kind of capacity. You've got to do emotional labor. You've got to be smiling. You've got to be happy, right? You can't be grumpy and this kind of thing, right? That's extremely hard and very taxing as well. So you've got to have all these kinds of abilities just to be able to do this job, which isn't even paid that much. And this is a kind of pretty typical job of a kind of services industry, emotional labor era, right, as well. Of course, many of us are just kind of sitting in front of computers as well. We're constantly typing, you scroll, you read emails, and then when you finish work and you do a bit more scrolling in the evening, right, or whatever, you're scrolling on Twitter or whatever. And all this time, we have these kind of algorithms. All this is designed, right, to generate profit. You have algorithms directing your attention in some ways and blocking off other ways. There might be advertisements or people are extracting profit from you in all sorts of ways while you're doing all of this. So it was all of these things I was trying to bring together to show how in the post-Fordist era, which is a very precarious and, as I say, neoliberal era anyway, it's like we don't have much work control. We've got less money and lower quality of life in certain ways. You add to this all these kind of emotional restriction of emotional and cognitive norms and sensory norms. We're constantly bombarded by flashing lights and advertisements and stuff like this. This is just an absolutely hellish place to live if you fall outside, even slightly outside those cognitive and sensory and emotional norms. So it's not just diagnoses like autism which have risen in this period, it's all sorts of diagnoses. So that's why I call it a mass disabling event. I'd say people I don't think there's a very clear and strict line between disabled and non-disabled, but it's like things that might have been relatively minor disabilities before became much more significant disabilities, and some things which probably wouldn't have been disabilities at all before became disabilities. And also kind of discrimination against people who fall outside the norms in these ways increases in all sorts of ways. And it's not just work as well, right? It's the whole ideal of what's an ideal person changes, of the kind of person who can do well at school or we should produce at school. or who's a normal child, who's not weird, and who gets bullied, and those kind of things changes in line with these norms. So it's not just about the workplace, it's about how the broader logics of post-Fordism kind of change the normal person and who falls inside and outside of that. So yeah, that's why I describe it as a mass disabling event, and really why I think the neurodiversity movement just had to arise at that point, right? People were just suffering so much, there had to be a new movement.
That was Robert Chapman, author of Empire of Normality, Neurodiversity and Capitalism. Our next extract features Rafeef Ziadah, Riya Al-Sana and Katy Fox-Hoddess from our episode that was released on the 28th of May. I was going to ask about some of the Block the Boats actions, and indeed ask about how differences in labour law between countries affects the kinds of actions that have taken place. And I was going to ask about, the relationship, I guess, between community-based organising and worker organising, and how a good sort of relationship can affect the efficacy of action. Is there any more that you'd like to say on that? Because it's clearly been such a big site of kind of action and success, over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I'm sure Rafeef will speak on this as well. So we have this ongoing research project that we've been carrying out over a number of years, speaking with dock worker union activists and community activists in several countries, including the US and Sweden and South Africa and Tunisia, where we've seen these port-based actions. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the country context in terms of the legal differences is really significant. In Sweden, in 2010, the dock worker union, their leadership just simply decided we're not going to handle Israeli cargo. I mean, that would be an incredibly difficult thing to do legally in countries like the UK or the US. So in other countries like the US, again, they've had to find these sort of creative workarounds. And the US is probably the country where we've seen the most port-based actions. So there have been actions in the ports of Oakland and Seattle and Los Angeles, Long Beach and New York, New Jersey, smaller actions in Tampa, and actions as well in Canada at the port of Vancouver and the port of Prince Rupert. So North America has been very strong in this area of port-based actions, particularly in 2014 and 2021. And that interplay between the community side and the union side is so critical for the success of those actions, when it's very difficult legally for workers to take action on their own, to simply go on strike. So you get these kind of intricate choreographies between community activists who have close connections to insiders in the union who serve as sort of bridge builders or go-betweens to help the community activists really understand the context for the union, the political context, the legal context, how the union makes decisions, their governance structure, and so on, as well as helping the community activists, orient to the port, the geography of the port, which are the terminals to hit, what time, how do they track the ships, how do they know how long they're going to be there, and so on. So very close collaborations, and those organizing relationships, the effectiveness of those organizing relationships is really absolutely central. We have seen blockades that have been pulled off at ports with little union support, but they don't tend to be very long lasting. So they tend to be sort of one-offs that go for a few hours. And that's great that, the activists have been able to pull that off. But the most effective actions we've seen have happened in places like Oakland, California, where Local 10 of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union has this long history of radical politics and has developed a very close relationship with community-based activists over a number of years, and very close collaboration. And so because these actions really depend on workers refusing to cross community picket lines, refusing to go into the workplace and handle the cargo, that's why it's so important to really try to build those strong-rooted organizing relationships.
Yeah, I just want to take us back to the trade union call from Palestine, because that call very much centered the idea of halting the arms trade, of making sure that the factories that are producing the arms and where they're being shipped is stopped. And for us to do that, for us to achieve that goal, it makes a lot more sense if the workers inside are actually dropping, just stopping the production line, or not doing the movement of these things. If ultimately our goal is to actually impact the arms trade, it makes sense when the workers inside the factories or on the docks are on side and actually not handling those products. Ultimately, we don't want to just block a factory for a few hours or for a day. We want that contract to be dropped completely, forever. And for that to happen, it's very important to have that relationship between inside the factory and the community activists outside. The community activists outside, as Katy was just explaining, can really bring the power to bear on shutting down the factory for a day, but also speaking with workers about the arms trade, about what is happening in Gaza today, ensuring that they become active members of their union that speak out on Palestine. So those community pickets are really educational spaces, and they are really outreach spaces for the workers themselves to learn about Palestine, to learn about the arms trade, but also to become union organizers. And this takes us back to your first question, to Riya, around why should unions do this? I think this is how the trade union itself becomes reinvigorated. You get new activists that learn about the contracts they're working on, but also learn about the power of the union, that they as workers need to be involved to understand what they're producing, why they're producing it, and where it's going. So in everything we've seen, whether in arms factory or on the docks, community activists understanding the trade union, understanding the history of the trade union, the struggles of that trade union, the struggles of the workers within the factory is really important for that conversation. And I always go back to our ultimate aim. Our ultimate aim, and what the call from Palestine was about, is a halt to the arms trade. That's what we want to happen, not for a few hours, but an actual ending of those supplies that keep going. And for us to do that, community activists and trade unions need to be working together. And ultimately, what we've seen in the various places we've looked at, up and down the UK, but also around the world, that's when the actions are most effective. It's when that slow building takes place. It's where that communication takes place. And we keep that goal in mind of actually ending the contracts once and for all.
I guess just on that, I mean, what's your sense of the position of workers in trade unions within the factories themselves? I appreciate that's talking about a large number of people there, but have you got any sense of people feeling uncomfortable and not wanting to produce goods that are bound for Israel?
I mean, absolutely. I think that's happening. And we get questions on a daily basis of people working in factories. And once they see the picket lines outside and once people speak to them, they start questioning. But that's where it's very important how we speak to workers on these picket lines, reaching out to them, telling them why we are there, not yelling at them or screaming at them, makes a huge difference, because ultimately they are allies that we want to organize. Organizing within the arms industry is a very difficult thing for people who are anti-militarist in general. It's a sector that builds weapons. Like, that's what it's based on. So trying to organize within that sector is extremely difficult. Trying to convince people that those factories themselves can be doing something different is a huge ask. But ultimately, we are speaking about not just Palestine, but changing those industries and changing our economies to more just economies that produce things that are actually helpful for humanity, not just destructive. And this leads us to that much bigger conversation around our economies, a just transition. What does that all mean? And this all part and parcel of the conversations trade unions need to be having today. And I'm sure Riya has a lot to add to this from the conversations we've been having around factory organizing, and also how that works within the trade union movement. We've seen Unite the Union, for example, putting out statements about this kind of work from the leadership perspective, saying our job is just to protect jobs. And what we are saying is, no, actually, unions have a bigger job than just that. They have a job of also putting forward visions of the world that are more just for workers. But maybe Riya can elaborate a bit more about what's been going on in Unite in particular.
Just to follow up from what Rafeef was saying in relation to kind of shifts that are also happening internally within these very hard to organize within and operate within sectors, right, such as the arms industry, that even within those we have seen movements and shifts that are very small, that are inadequate to answer to the need of the moment, but nonetheless, they are very significant milestones and shifts that we have to recognize and kind of think about and build on. Very early on in October, the organizers within the aerospace industry in Unite in the UK, which is the union that unionizes most of the workers in the arms industry and one of the biggest unions in the country, that nominally had a very good policy on Palestine. It had a BDS policy passed a very long time ago, but still was kind of, its members were still very much complicit and involved. It was kind of, the members were involved in arms production that were going into the F-35 and other weaponry that was used by Israel in its attack on Gaza and in other attacks on Palestinians for a long time. And very early on in October, organizing by Unite members within that sector forced the leadership to issue a position that mandated them to allowing workers to refuse to work on products destined to Israel without being disciplined in a way. So allowing workers the space to go and talk to their reps if they felt like that's something that they didn't want to work on. Later on, in April this year, a much stronger position was also put out that was much more kind of in support of against the supply of arms to Israel, but with a little caveat that it's not about parts, that they will not support the ban of export of parts that end up in military products that is then destined to Israel, which is the majority of what kind of the UK is producing, right? It's not directly end result weapons that are going to Israel, but it's much more around specific parts that are then shipped to the US or other countries that are then kind of assembled and destined to Israel. And I think it has been, for many activists on the outside, it has been surprising to hear and to learn and to kind of accept also that there are workers within that industry internally that are working to organize their colleagues and to kind of inform them about the complicity of that sector as a whole with what is going on in Palestine, and that they're internally working towards shifting their union positions and moving away from these kind of contracts like Rafeef was talking about. And these are often are steps such as passing motions to support, for example, medical aid for Palestine, forcing a conversation within a branch meeting around Palestine, having a conversation after kind of blockades happen outside of the factory with the workers inside about why that blockade was taking place, what is the impetus of that, of people coming to that factory and so on. And so I think building on what Katy and Rafeef were saying earlier about this kind of duality of having workers on the inside and supported by community activists on the outside, and the community activists on the outside recognizing that there are workers on the inside that are also trying to achieve the same goals, and kind of thinking through of how those two elements reinforce each other. Because often there is the tendency, as Rafeef mentioned, of kind of looking at the arms industry and just assuming that everybody that works in the arms industry is very much invested in it. They don't care about Palestinian life, and they're not interested in kind of also moving away from war-making economies to more just-based economies, right? And I think this moment and these examples really prove differently, and I think really prove to us that we have to kind of think seriously about what does it mean to have those two elements working together. And we see these shifts kind of taking place. They're not as fast as we want them to be, but they are important building stones and building blocks that we have to think through how we work with them and how we think about them seriously, even in such a sector that is as difficult to organize in as the arms trade. It is way more difficult than, transport sectors and so on. But there is also a history in this sector of workers dropping the tools, right? Of saying, no, we will not be producing weapons that are destined. We think about it in terms of Chile and other moments in history. And I think what is happening now in terms of the organizing in relation to Palestine and in response to the call from the Palestinian trade union movement also points to the direction of the possibilities. Yeah.
That was Rafeef Ziadah, Riya and Katy Fox-Hoddess in conversation about the international labour movement's solidarity with Palestine. Finally, we go now to Kalonji Changa and Joy James, both contributors to Beyond Cop Cities, Dismantling State and Corporate-Funded Armies and Prisons. This episode was released on the 9th of October. Definitely, you see the logic of colonialism being sort of practiced domestically through this kind of policing, right? And we know that the history of foreign policy strategies being deployed in domestic policing is very long, almost from the inception of policing in the mid-19th century. I wonder if Joy or Kalonji would like to pick up on what you were saying about how, I guess, the people in power view their own, the working class, people of color, these communities, the same way as they view ordinary people in Latin America.
Yeah, I think to Liliana's point, oftentimes places like Latin America or regions are overlooked, much like a number of different inner city neighborhoods throughout the United States. There's been reports of murders inside of places like Chicago, New York, Connecticut, different places. Me growing up in Connecticut, I could just remember police corruption at an early age. There were cops who brought drugs into the community, and it was well known. There was cops who would take drugs from one particular project or whatever the case is, bring it to another, and forcing youth to sell. This isn't something I saw on TV. This isn't something that I heard about. This was going on in my neighborhood, and we knew which cops were which, and we knew which cops would take you and bang your head up against the wall. We would get attacked by police so much that I wouldn't even tell my parents just because I wanted to go outside, because I knew that if I told them what was going on, then I wouldn't be able to hang out. I wouldn't be able to go with my friends or whatever the case is. This is a reality. This is at 13, 14 years old, cops throwing folks on the ground. This is a place where you talk about, especially with quote unquote undocumented or immigrants. And we talk about immigrants, again, as Liliana mentioned, the first thing that foolish Americans in particular think of is Mexicans. They don't know that when you talk about ICE and immigration, the Haitian population has been under heavy attack. When you talk about these ICE facilities, you can find a lot of others, besides quote unquote, what these clowns are talking about building a wall. There's been instances in certain neighborhoods where police have literally stuck screwdrivers up the anus of individuals talking about they were looking for drugs, doing all types of things. So when we talk about policing on an international level, we don't have to go too far, because we can look at the U.S. military and look at the over 900 bases that exist across the planet. No country can set up shop outside of the U.S. or pretty much in the Western Hemisphere. However, the U.S. has dominion, Israel and the U.S. You're talking about the U.S. being 5% of the world population, controlling 25% of all resources. You're talking about the U.S. being 5% of the world population and housing over 25% of all prisoners on the planet. But yet they reign supreme. They hold dominion over the globe. They can set up shop wherever they want to. And when they can't get their way, they will set up these proxy wars, and they will get folks like the Ukraine in a jam because they want to move into those particular regions. They want to control these resources. So we have this false sense of patriotic love for our nation, so on and so forth, when the reality is the policing, home and abroad, is literally to maintain the gangs. And we're talking about the gangs being the quote unquote founding fathers who stole this land, who murdered these people. I mean, just look at Wilani Forest alone, where this whole cop city is. You're talking about a place where they massacred and ran off natives of that particular land, the original victims of gentrification here in the United States. Then they turned it into a prison farm. Now they want to turn it into essentially the local establishment of the military. They want to turn it into a base so they can play cops and robbers. And these corporations are funding it. They're in cahoots because They benefit from it. At the end of the day, it's all about capitalism. It's all about imperialism. And people will suffer. And as Liliana pointed out, yes, there'll be more coups. Why are there coups? Because it's about domination. It's about control. It's about debt. It's about keeping folks in servitude. So at the end of the day, it's like, collateral damage.
I mean, I'm thinking of what Pluto put on its digital platform. There's a box with a question in it. So the question is from Pluto, what happens when the police become an army? I mean, I think that's to the point. I don't know who wrote that question, but it's like, it works for us, right? From that question, how do we resist an army? There are different kinds of occupations, right? And death squads, as Liliana has put forward and Kalonji has put forward as well. I see there's contradictions that we're still grappling with, and even being able to comprehend that this has become, or historically has been, an army. As Kalonji says, first it's indigenous land, then it's a plantation, then it's a prison farm, and now it's a training area for predatory behavior against all life, not just human life, but in taking over that territory, they poison the water, they're poisoning the land, and no environmental organization is going to see or collect the data on these forms of destruction. Once you start shooting off this kind of militarized present, you're going to poison the air. It's going to have an impact of sound on the families, the Black working families. So we need clean air, clean water, clean land. Kalonji was talking earlier about the storms, the hurricanes. And so I think the way in which we agree to organizing by accepting the reality of varied occupations and militarized aggression, that will take us out of the liberal zone. And I think that's one of the things we were trying to do in Beyond Cobb Cities, to the extent that we were able to translate parts of it into Spanish or Portuguese, the contributions that are made by multiple people, including Black Power Media's interviews. We would have to give up the fairy tale that you could vote your way out of an occupation. Nobody else is managing to do that around the globe. Why would we be able to do that? And so it seems to me that at least acknowledging the structured violence against communities, but also against all populations that are seeking healthy autonomy, that would be a start. But I think in a lot of ways, when people want to frame the struggle into a sort of narrow corridor that is aligned with conventional liberal politics, I think that's how we're not just taking our eyes away from, the struggle, but we're actually changing the narrative of the struggle. As if you can fix this without having a major endeavor to confront all predatory acts by the state. And I guess I want to add one thing. I mean, this is personal for all of us on different levels, but I just want to add one thing. We're compromised. All our communities are. This definitely has a heavy impact on Indigenous, working class, poor people, undocumented people. But there are a number of people who are Black mayors, and a number of people who are Black cops, and a number of people who are Black military running the Pentagon, or the woman who's at the UN who keeps refusing to allow a call for a ceasefire to happen. So I think decades ago, there was a kind of racial solidarity that we would say, we're on the outside and we're oppressed. And now there's so many compradors. We would have to let go of certain kind of sentimental affiliations based on what we look like, and definitely focus increasingly on what war resistance is.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. That really kind of speaks to, I think there was a quote in the book, which is referring to Atlanta from Reverend Matthew V. Johnson, who says that Atlanta is the blackest city in America, with the Black leadership class, and yet it also has the largest racial income disparity in the country. And you really kind of get the sense that the limits of electoralism as a political strategy are being felt there. Haven't there been something like 116,000 signatures delivered for this public referendum to put the brakes on it? And yet every sort of cynical legal challenge has been kind of thrown in the face of that. The kind of intimidation of the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. I mean, those charges I think were just dropped this week. But when there is this sort of asymmetry of power, as you say, when you're trying to resist and organize against militarized aggression, there has nevertheless been this kind of insistence on non-violence as an organizing principle. Yeah, what would you say to that?
Well, the language that I use is war resistance, because I don't want to get caught between this, like, oh, are you for or against? I believe that, we've also talked about the language of revolutionary love. Black Power Media has, in this book, actually, it's a transcript of, I think the title is Attempted Assassinations Against Mumia Abu-Jamal, Political Prisoners, right? Kalonji and BPM worked on Marcellus Williams' case. He was executed by the state of Missouri. There are other executions. I mean, there are different ways to kill people in the US, right? And so it's a comprehensive struggle. I think in a lot of ways, we're still fighting for the narrative of clarity because, again, people are kind of painting it as something else. Just conventional politics. Conventional politics is what created the war zone because it's empire and it's colonialism. So one of the things, and then I'll stop about the book, when we say beyond cop cities, we're also talking about the prisons. So we have Kevin Rashid Johnson talking about how gangs were organized by wardens and guards, right? When Kalonji was talking about the violence in our communities is not always internal. There are external factors and actors who come into the communities, right? And who bring the violence, who bring the drugs, bring guns, etc. So it's complicated. Obviously, on this podcast, we can't solve it. But what I'm trying to do is move beyond fairy tale narratives of comfort, like bedtime stories that you would, give for your 5-year-old to reassure them. I think the issue of clarity and accepting the reality of a war machine is the first line of self-defense. And then what you do later in terms of security apparatuses becomes something else, and sometimes private to your community.
That was Kalonji Changa and Joy James on Radicals in Conversation. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show this year. If you're not already a subscriber, then please do subscribe. You can also rate us or leave us a review wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. It's all helpful. A final reminder that as a listener of Radicals in Conversation, you can get a lovely 40% off the books that have been featured on the show this year. Just go over to plutobooks.com and use the coupon podcast at the checkout. We'll be back in January 2025. So until then, thanks very much for listening and goodbye.